Chapter 10, Women's Wing. They navigated a maze of dimly lit corridors, descending a series of worn stairs before arriving at a pair of weathered double doors. Steve's flashlight swept upward, illuminating a sign that read, Serenity Hall, Female Asylum Wing. As he pushed the doors open, they stepped into a dim corridor, its walls lined with old Victorian portraits in warped frames, their glass cracked and faded. The stern faces of nurses and solemn patients seemed to watch them, their expressions intense. In the flickering beam of Steve's flashlight, the faces appeared almost alive. Kevin glanced at the pictures uneasily. "It feels like they are watching us." The smell of smoke wafted through the air, causing their eyes to water. As they ventured deeper into the corridor, the scent intensified, and Kevin's worry grew. It smelled unmistakably like there was a fire in the building. Just as he was about to voice his concerns, Steve broke the silence. "All right, we're here," Steve said, aiming his flashlight at a weathered sign that read "Danger, keep out," in bold red letters. The sign stood before a pitch-black corridor, yellow plastic strips crisscrossing the entrance and fluttering slightly as if caught in a ghostly breeze. Fire damage scarred the walls and ceiling ahead. Dave gestured toward the charred remains. This was the tragic end to Crowley's horrific history. On December 8, 1978, a devastating fire consumed this entire wing, which had originally been designed for just 40 patients. But due to severe overcrowding, it housed more than double that number. The investigation into the fire's origin was inconclusive. Some theories suggested faulty electrical wiring, while others speculated that one of the patients might have started the blaze. But no definitive proof was ever found. The intense media scrutiny and negative press were relentless, prompting an investigation into why safety regulations were ignored. The asylum was forced to close just days after the incident. The scandal shook the community, leaving many questions unanswered and families devastated. "Over 80 women lost their lives in that fire," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "It's crazy how the scent of smoke is still here," Kevin said. "The fire was over 40 years ago, yet it's still so strong." "In an old, abandoned building like this, the smell of smoke can linger for decades," Steve added. Dave shone his flashlight at Tanya. "Can you channel any spirits?" She nodded slowly. Tanya's eyes glazed over as the acrid odor filled her nostrils, triggering a vivid psychic vision. Suddenly, she was no longer in the present, but transported back to that fateful day. The asylum's wooden beams crackled and splintered as flames devoured them. Frantic cries of women echoed in her mind. Dave could see the pain evident on Tanya's face. "Are you seeing something, Tanya? Do the spirits want to communicate with us?" "I see women panicking, desperately trying to escape," Tanya whispered, her voice trembling. "The fire doors are sealed, they are trapped." She could almost feel the intense heat on her skin and hear the agonizing screams of the women, devoured by the crackling flames. In her mind's eye, a shadow shifted within the inferno, not a woman, but something else entirely. It emerged from the flames with unnatural grace, its white eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity that defied explanation. The figure stood watching the chaos, its presence far more sinister than anything she could comprehend. The vision's raw power overwhelmed her. Tanya's legs buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the boundary between past and present dissolving around her. Steve and Kevin crouched beside her. "Just give me a moment," she said, catching her breath. Dave stepped closer to the darkness. "Let's go in," he said, grinning at the team. "Are you mad?" Steve asked, raising an eyebrow. "The structure could be completely unsafe after the fire. There's no way I'm taking that risk." Dave smiled wryly. "Come on, Steve, I was just kidding." "I'm mad, but not that mad." Chapter 11, Strange Echo Within. Dave pointed his camera into the darkness beyond the warning sign. I've never seen darkness like this before. It's just pure black. He glanced at the team. It feels as if the darkness itself is alive. Dave stepped a bit closer to the dark entranceway of the corridor. Don't worry, everyone, I'm not going in. I just want a better view inside. Everyone, point your flashlights into the darkness. Steve and Kevin got up off the floor and hesitantly shone their beams into the blackness. The darkness seemed to swallow the light, leaving only faint glimmers in its depths. Hello? Dave shouted into the stillness, but only an eerie silence responded. After almost a minute, his voice echoed back, distorted and unnatural, hello. He turned the camera on himself, his expression shocked. Then a moment later a deep, mournful moan emanated from within the deep darkness. It did not sound human. A chill ran down Dave's spine. Did you hear that? He asked, heart racing. That was fucking freaky. Probably just the acoustics, Steve suggested. They backed away. Dave frowned, confused. What are you doing? Keep your lights in there. Reluctantly, they moved forward again, flashlights aimed into the oppressive darkness. A shuffling sound suddenly echoed from within the void. Is there someone in there? Dave called out. Silence fell once more. He activated the spirit box. We heard you in there. Does anyone want to speak to us? You can communicate through this device, he said, holding it toward the darkness. Anyone? I dare you. His voice carried a hint of bravado. The spirit box remained silent. Dave glanced at Tanya, who was slowly getting back to her feet. Would you like to speak through Tanya? She has the power to communicate with you. Tanya stiffened. A wave of tension washed over her as something stirred in the blackness. She could feel it watching, not a spirit, but something else entirely. Whatever was lurking in the darkness was not just unfriendly. It was beyond any supernatural encounter she'd experienced before. It was something evil. I don't think we want to mess around with whatever is in there, she whispered urgently. Just then the spirit box crackled with static, startling everyone. Dave leaned closer, listening intently for any voice among the noise, but all he heard was an odd sound reminiscent of crackling fire, and the faint screaming of women. Filtering through the static. Whoa, Dave said, feeling a tingle run down his spine. Okay, that is seriously weird, he said into the camera. You all heard that, right? Dave asked, exchanging glances with the team. They nodded uneasily. If there's someone in there, give us a sign, anything. Dave challenged the unseen presence. They waited, but the silence stretched on. Okay, Dave finally sighed, turning away. Let's move on. I think we've gathered enough paranormal evidence here. As they stepped away from the entrance, relief washed over them. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed through the air, followed by a thunderous crash that sent debris scattering and dust billowing into their lungs. The team jumped in fright. Holy shit! Dave exclaimed as they coughed. I think a wall just came down, Steve said nervously. This place is falling apart, let's get out of here fast. Quickly, they moved away from the women's wing, and through the passageway, an unsettling feeling crept in, something felt as if it were following them. They nervously glanced back, only to be met by the empty darkness. After a while, they entered a narrow corridor, lined with rooms on one side and windows on the other. Dust floated lazily in the dim light filtering through cracked panes, and the peeling wallpaper hung like tattered memories from the walls. Dave was convinced he heard someone whispering his name, but the others heard nothing. Steve shrugged it off as the wind, though Dave remained certain that someone, or something, was calling him. This unsettling sensation put him on edge. Chapter 12, The Day Hall. Finally, they reached an archway with a sign above it that read, "The Gathering Place, the Day Hall." The team stepped into the large hall, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Dave scanned the darkness of the large hall with his camera, capturing the eerie stillness. Mismatched wooden tables and chairs were scattered haphazardly. Kevin passed a cluster of overturned chairs when a dissonant note suddenly rang out nearby, making him freeze. He turned to see an old piano in the corner, its haunting sound resonating through the large hall. Steve glanced at the piano and pointed upward. Leaky ceiling. Kevin nodded, relieved. Tanya wandered through the hall, brushing her fingers across a dusty table. Suddenly, she froze, her breath catching as a chilling sensation crept up her spine. Tanya walked over to a rusted radiator on the far side of the room. Dave and Kevin followed, their cameras trained on her. She stood silently for a moment before speaking. "Are you channeling any spirits?" Dave asked. Tanya closed her eyes, her face clouded with concentration. "There's so much sadness. Fear in this room," she said softly. "I'm sensing a child." "A child?" Kevin exclaimed in disbelief. "Jesus, they kept children here?" "Yes, children were often mixed in with adults in asylums," Dave replied, his tone somber. "That's fucked up," Kevin said, horrified. Dave then turned his attention back to Tanya, who was still standing in front of the radiator, her posture tense. "Tanya? Is the child still here with us?" "Yes," she said, her voice strained. Dave steadied the camera, his voice low and respectful. "We know you're here with us. We just want to help you. Can you hear us?" A heavy silence settled over them, broken only by the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows. Tanya spoke again, her voice unsteady. "The child." She paused, gathering herself before continuing, "A boy. His name is Cedric." Visions of the past began to unfold before her. Faint, grey, semi-transparent figures materialized, hovering in the air like ghostly echoes. They drifted slowly, their forms shimmering around her. Orderlies. Dragging him, kicking and screaming, to the radiator. They used to chain him here. He was alone and scared. She closed her eyes, struggling to maintain the psychic link to the images replaying in her mind. "I'm seeing something else," she said, her voice cracked. "The orderlies come back and unchain him. He's terrified, he runs. He runs to the women's wing." She stumbled backward, completely drained. "I've lost the link," she said, leaning against the wall, her breath shallow. "It's okay, Tanya," Dave said gently. "You rest. I'll continue from here." Dave held the spirit box in his hand, his voice steady. "Can you tell us your name? Can you speak to us? We want to help you. There is no need to be afraid." Suddenly, the spirit box crackled to life, filling the room with loud static. The team listened intently as the noise intensified, merging with the sound of heavy rain outside. Then, through the crackling, a voice cut through, sharp and distorted. "Cedric." It was the voice of a small child. "Cedric?" Dave repeated in astonishment. "Cedric, do you want to tell us something?" The room grew colder, and the spirit box flickered again. "Cedric. Cedric. Cedric," the voice echoed, frantic and hysterical. Sparks began flying from the spirit box, and Dave quickly threw it to the floor to avoid an electric shock. Dave gingerly picked up the smoking device as Kevin moved closer, his camera focused on both Dave and the damaged spirit box. That was messed up, Kevin said, still shaken. What's creepy is that it sounded like a small boy, and when he said his name was Cedric. That really put the shits up me. He glanced at Tanya, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. Just like you said. Let's sit for a moment, Dave suggested. See if we can get anything more about Cedric. They pulled out chairs and sat around a nearby table. Tanya, do you want to rest for a bit? Dave asked gently. I'm okay, just give me a minute, she replied, her breath still uneven. Dave nodded and gave her a thumbs up. He unlocked his phone and opened Google, typing, "boy named Cedric dies in Crowley Asylum," into the search bar. However, just as the results began to load, the connection dropped, leaving him staring at a blank screen. No internet, Dave said, frowning. Kevin and Steve checked their phones but found the same issue. Probably just the signal. We're in the middle of nowhere, Steve said, trying to reassure them. Maybe, Dave muttered. Let's check the map and plan our next move. They leaned over Steve's phone as he studied the asylum layout, debating their next steps. Tanya heard faint, light footsteps behind her and turned, but found nothing there. She froze as a small, cold hand slipped into hers, feeling unmistakably like a child's. She inhaled sharply, her heart pounding, but before she could react, the sensation vanished. We're heading to the next location. Are you sure you're all right? Dave shouted over to Tanya. Tanya nodded her head slowly, her eyes distant. She could still feel the overwhelming sadness, the sorrow of the child who had touched her hand, searching for something, someone. A mother. Chapter 13, The Stain. They collectively moved out of the gathering place, descending to the level below. A weathered sign above the double doorway proclaimed this floor as the Sanctuary of Renewal. The name of this floor gives the impression of safety and rehabilitation, Dave scoffed, eyeing the faded plaque on the wall. The Sanctuary of Renewal, he read aloud, his voice dripping with sarcasm. As they passed a line of rooms, Dave poked his head into one of the open doors. It was a padded cell, dimly lit by his flashlight, revealing walls covered in worn, tattered fabric. The absence of windows left the room shrouded in darkness, amplifying his unease. Imagine being locked away in here, he said, shivering at the thought. They probably just left them for days. Maybe weeks, or even months, forgotten. It's terrifying. He stepped back into the corridor and glanced into his camera. They kept the more disturbed patients here, but in truth, many were individuals with disabilities or, for the older patients, conditions like dementia. In 1964, the asylum hit the news again with more scandal. Patients were injected with cancer cells without their consent or knowledge. 19 elderly, frail individuals were subjected to this unethical acts. Suddenly, loud laughter could be heard from one of the rooms, cutting Dave off mid-sentence. Did you all hear that? Dave asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Laughter? Kevin replied, unease in his voice. It came from that room. He pointed to a door that creaked open by itself, just a few inches. They exchanged nervous glances before stepping inside, cameras raised. Hello? Dave called, his voice low and cautious. The team explored the room, but it seemed empty. What's that? Dave asked, pointing at a dark stain on the wall. Mold, Steve replied dismissively. Dave studied it closely. It's growing. What? No way, Kevin said, leaning in with his camera for a better look. Realization dawned on him. You're right, it's growing. What the hell is it? They watched in disbelief as the fuzzy, slimy growth, black and spreading, crept across the wall, climbing upward like a sinister shadow. Then, with a deafening crash, the door slammed shut behind them. Tanya, startled by the bang, let out a sharp shriek. "Fuck!" Kevin yelled, rushing toward the door. He fumbled in the darkness for the handle, trembling fingers finally finding it. But when he tried to turn it, he recoiled. "Jesus! Open the door!" Dave shouted, panic rising in his voice. "I'm fucking trying," Kevin exclaimed. "The handle feels like ice. You try it if you don't believe me." Dave pushed Kevin aside and grasped the handle himself. He immediately let go with a gasp. It was indeed like holding ice. They stood in the darkness, fear coursing through them as they wondered what to do next. Then they heard the laughter again behind them, almost mocking. They turned, their hearts racing. The laughter abruptly stopped, and the door creaked open slowly. Without hesitation, they bolted into the corridor. "Holy crap! That was insane!" Kevin shouted as they ran, putting distance between themselves and the room while trying to catch their breath. They stood at the end of the dark corridor, still visibly shaken. "Did you see that? The stain on the wall, it grew." Dave yelled excitedly into the camera, almost manic. "And the laughter. And the door slamming shut, something was definitely keeping it closed." He looked at the team, still buzzing. "We need to go back in and investigate." "I'm not going back in that room, mate," Kevin said with a nervous look. "We're paranormal investigators," Dips hit. "This is our job," Dave snapped, his mood shifting from excitement to anger. Kevin shot Dave a look, his heart still racing. "Feel free to take a look," he said, shaking his head. "But I'm not going back in there." "Come on," Dave urged. "I'm being serious. We need to go back in and investigate." The team refused to budge. "Steve, you're not scared, you? I thought you didn't believe in this stuff." He tugged at Steve's sleeve, pulling him toward the room. Steve pulled back. Dave stared at him in disbelief. He muttered under his breath, "Bunch of chicken shits." Dave cautiously stepped back into the room. A moment later, he exited and walked down the corridor to his team, who looked at him pensively. "Empty," Dave confirmed. They looked at each other, disbelief written on their faces. Even Steve was beginning to think there was more going on in the asylum than met the eye, something unnatural and unexplained. The team turned and quietly walked through the doorway, feeling once again that unsettling sensation of being watched. Chapter 14, Glint of the Evil Eye. They continued down a long corridor, cold wind and rain seeping through the broken windows. Crumbling plaster hung from the ceiling like decaying skin. Tattered carpets stretched beneath their feet, worn and threadbare, while ahead, abandoned filing cabinets lay dragged out into the hallway. One was tipped on its side, blocking their path and forcing them to climb over it. A drawer had fallen out, and folders lay scattered across the floor, some of the papers fluttering in the breeze. Dave bent down and picked up one of the brown folders from the dusty floor. "Look at this, patient files," he said, excitedly. Steve stepped forward, his flashlight beam catching both Dave and the yellowed paper in his hands. Kevin pointed the camera at the file. The shot wavered at first, then slowly came into focus, the text appearing in a grainy green hue from the night vision. "What does it say?" Tanya asked, moving closer. Dave leaned in, carefully examining the brittle file. As he began to read it aloud, his voice took on a serious tone, drawing the attention of the others in the room. Crowley Asylum. Experimental Treatment Authorization. Subject, Patient Number 27. Treatment, Memory Erasure and Reprogramming Protocol. I, Arthur Timothy Burns, Manager of Crowley Asylum, hereby authorize the following experimental treatment for patient number 27. 1. Administration of high-dose LSD. 2. Confinement in complete darkness for an extended period. This treatment aims to erase existing memories and facilitate the implantation of new behavioral patterns. The subject has been deemed an ideal candidate for this procedure based on their psychological profile and previous responses to standard therapies. By signing below, I acknowledge the potential risks and affirm that this experiment aligns with the asylum's research objectives. All staff involved are to maintain strict confidentiality regarding this procedure. Authorized by Arthur Timothy Burns, Manager, Darkwood Asylum. Date, the 30th of November 1956. Note, this document is classified. Unauthorized access or dissemination is strictly prohibited. Dave pulled out another file from the folder. Patient name, Emily Carter. Age, 12. Dave paused, fully aware that what he was about to uncover would be deeply disturbing. He continued reading. Admission date, the 15th of March 1957. Diagnosis, severe depression, behavioral issues. Treatment history. Initial assessment, Emily was admitted after exhibiting signs of severe depression and aggressive behavior towards herself and others. Reports indicate she had been a victim of severe abuse at home. Treatment plan. The initial treatment plan included talk therapy and group sessions, but due to her escalating behavior, it was deemed ineffective. Interventions. Date, the 10th of May 1957. Procedure. Patient was restrained and subjected to LSD administration to assess psychological resilience. Date, the 15th of May 1957. Procedure. Administrated LSD in a dark, sensory deprivation room to explore memory erasure. The patient was kept in isolation for 5 days following administration. Reports indicate extreme agitation and hallucinations. Date, the 27th of May 1957. Patient exhibited signs of severe distress post-treatment. Refused to speak for over a week. Date, the 11th of June 1957. Attempted self-harm, transferred to isolation room for safety. Date, the 28th of June 1957. Last entry, patient's condition has deteriorated significantly. Staff reported hearing her sobbing in the isolation room at night. The patient claimed to have seen a large black dog that no one else could see. Discharge status. Emily was never discharged. Records indicate she disappeared from the facility under mysterious circumstances in late 1957. No further information available. Tanya's face paled as she processed the information. Monsters, she said with disgust. Absolute monsters. This place is sick. Dave flipped through another file, his face going pale as he finished reading. This? He held up the file. Details how mentally disabled children were. He trailed off, his words catching in his throat. A shift in the room, something subtle yet unmistakable, made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. His eyes widened, pupils dilating. Jesus Christ, he shouted, startling the others. He froze, pointing ahead. Look! In the distance, a single eye glinted in the darkness. The team stared in horror as the eye blinked slowly, an unsettling glimmer in the darkness. Everyone aimed their flashlights down the corridor, to reveal a bird perched ominously on a cabinet ahead. Its feathers were ruffled and dull, blending into the shadows. The bird began squawking loudly, its single eye blinking rapidly in response to the sudden brightness. I think it's a raven, Kevin said, relieved. It must have gotten in through one of those broken windows. Dave let out a nervous laugh, hand on his chest. turning to the video camera. Quoth the raven, "Nevermore," Dave said as he recalled the haunting words of Poe. The team collectively exhaled, tension visibly leaving their bodies. Dave slipped the file back into the folder and set it on the cabinet. They turned toward the exit, beyond the raven, and approached cautiously. As they neared, the bird shifted, letting out a raspy croak that bounced off the walls in the corridor, sending a chill down their spines. As they drew closer to it, their pace slowed down. Dave laughed nervously. "What are we afraid of? It's just a bird." Yet the team continued to move slowly, careful not to alarm the creature. As they approached, the raven let out another raspy caw, its head darting with quick, sharp movements, its eyes fixed intently on them. A sense of unease settled over the group as they inched closer. The raven remained still, its eyes fixed on them in silence. They stepped closer. Without warning, the raven aggressively swooped down, its wings whipping the air as it let out a piercing screech. The team ducked instinctively, hearts pounding, but to their horror, the bird immediately turned and flew back at them for another attack. This time, it shot straight toward Tanya, its claws outstretched, ready to strike. With a fierce, croaky squawk, the raven lunged at her, its talons snagging tufts of her hair. Panic surged through the group as its beak violently pecked at her face. Tanya screamed, "Get it away from me," flailing to protect herself from the relentless assault. The team stood frozen in shock as the raven viciously clawed at Tanya. Finally, with a frantic flap of its wings, the bird flew down the corridor and out through one of the broken windows, disappearing into the night. The team stood in stunned silence, the echo of Tanya's scream still hanging in their ears. She was visibly shaken, trembling uncontrollably, her face scratched and bleeding as she sobbed hysterically. Kevin eased over to Tanya, his expression softening with concern. "You going to be okay?" He reached out cautiously, offering his hand as a gesture of support. He glanced back at the rest of the team, encouraging them to offer their reassurance as well. Dave stepped closer to Tanya, his hands shaking slightly as he opened his rucksack and pulled out a small first aid kit. "Let's get you cleaned up," he said, as he wiped the blood from her face with gentle, but unsteady hands, dabbing at the deep cuts with cotton swabs. Tanya flinched with each touch, her face contorted in pain as tears streaked down her cheeks. He continued to dab at her wounds gently, doing his best to minimize her discomfort. "Almost done," he said, maintaining eye contact to help ground her. "I've never seen a bird attack anyone before," Steve interjected, his voice trembling slightly. "What if it had bird flu? We saw all those dead birds outside. What if it's infected?" Dave, his nerves frayed, snapped at Steve's ill-timed comment. "Steve, shut the fuck up. You idiot." Tanya glanced nervously at Steve. Dave quickly turned back to her, trying to reassure her. It was probably just scared. We must have seemed like a threat. He finished applying antiseptic and gently placed a bandage over her wounds. Rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled through the shattered glass, its eerie whistle sending chills through the air. At the far end of the corridor, the double doors groaned open, then slammed shut with a deafening crash. They swung open once more, only to slam shut again, the sudden noise making them jump in surprise. Dave and Kevin quickly aimed their cameras at the double doors, adrenaline surging through them. A cold sweat formed on Dave's forehead as his pulse pounded in his ears. Kevin's hands trembled as he steadied his camera, his wide eyes filled with fear and disbelief. But no further movement followed, only an unsettling silence. "It's just the wind," Steve said nervously. "Yeah, right," Dave replied with sarcasm. "Just the wind."